Hi, this is Richard with the Week 2 feedback video. As you can probably see if you're being mindful, I'm in the studio by myself today. Craig's off overseas and he'll be beaming in with some comments throughout.
Hello from a long way away overseas at the moment. Sorry not to be with Richard and the team in the studio this morning, but as you can see, I've got hotel decor behind me.
So as a lot of learners have been noticing the stress response and starting to reduce it, some of them raise questions about stress motivating us. And a lot of people, I think, do use stress to motivate themselves, certainly students at Monash in my experience. And so Craig's got a few things to say about that.
Look, if you consider stress can be a good motivator, it's a lot better than apathy. And so the classic stress performance curve that lifts us out of apathy and gets us going, it's a lot more productive than that. So we often need pressure to get us moving to finally get on with the thing we've been putting off. But of course, too much stress and we go over the top of the stress performance curve and we don't function well. But the peak performance is not associated with stress. That's associated with complete focus in the moment. When, say, athletes talk about being in the zone or a flow state, it's not a high stress state. But so completely engaged in the present moment is paradoxically not worry about the outcome. And there's been some interesting research to show that mindfulness reduces motivation, but it actually increases performance. And people were saying, oh, I shouldn't be teaching it in workplaces because it reduces motivation. But motivation was measured by arousal or stress response and future focus. And mindfulness reduces both of those things. According to the study, that is, people feel less stressed, but the performance improves by better focus on task. And so it's about the present moment rather than future focus. It's about calm application. So there's a difference between being relaxed, fully engaged, as opposed to relaxed, apathetic.
And maybe we also just become less motivated to do meaningless work, and perhaps that's what the research is showing as well. Because of course mindfulness makes us more aware of what we're doing and connects us with things like values and just makes us more aware of how we're showing up in the world. Then of course there's the idea of good and bad stress, and again Craig's got some really interesting things to say about that.
Yeah, well, there's a kind of, if we perhaps think of challenge, being challenged, put in a situation that's difficult to deal with. And I suppose the bad stress is feeling avoidance, wishing it wasn't happening, wishing it was somewhere else. And that we don't deal well with the situation as well as we could. And of course we experience it as a very negative event. Whereas good stress, I suppose you could say, is where it's challenging, but a person turns towards the situation, has an attitude to it that this will be difficult, but I'll grow through it. I'll draw on my resources. I'll become more resilient. I'll learn something about myself. And so people have that attitude to challenging life events actually come out better for it at the end, even though it might have been difficult at the time. I suppose you could call that good stress.
Another source of stress is self-criticism, and a lot of learners have noticed that this week. Just that those negative stories that tend to run in our mind, that self-judgment and self-criticism, if we're paying attention when we're doing that, we notice that it actually triggers the fight and flight response. The amygdala, the stress response, the cortisol and the adrenaline all get triggered by self-criticism. And so noticing that, of course, makes a very strong case for stepping out of those habitual ways of relating to ourselves. Perhaps just letting go of those self-critical stories and refocusing on what we're doing, or even cultivating things like self-compassion and self-kindness. A lot of learners have expressed some regret about not having learned about mindfulness earlier in life. And I think that's a pretty common experience, actually, that once people start to realize the benefits of being present and accepting and kind to themselves, it's probably pretty natural that we think about all the times that we haven't perhaps been like that. And so that regret's sort of a natural thing, but hey, better late than never, right? And I guess the point of mindfulness is just to start practicing in whatever way we can as soon as we can. And so once we realize that perhaps we're being a little self-critical, a little bit, distracted, that's the perfect time to start practicing. I really like this question as well. Some learners have sort of started to question, hang on a sec, I'm observing my thoughts coming and going in my mind. So if I'm not my thoughts, who am I?
Some really interesting discussion about if I'm not my thoughts, then what am I? Who am I? Well, that's a very good question. And two, the emotions come and go as well, and physical sensations. So if we're not those things, if they come and go but we don't go, then what am I? Well, I suppose the only thing we could say about that is that all of those things are under observation. If we're mindful, we're just observing the coming and going of those things. So who knows, perhaps we're the observer of those events, those experiences, thoughts, feelings, sensations. And the observer doesn't seem to come and go like all of those transient events do. So maybe that's a little bit closer to what we are, but it's not ourselves in the usual way of thinking about ourselves, because we're not thinking about ourselves. We just are observing in a very impartial kind of way.
Then there's the formal practice. So this week we've been working with breath as the object for the meditation, and we introduced the training the puppy meditation as a way of deliberately cultivating gentleness and patience. And these are two very central qualities of mindfulness. This idea to be, patient with our practice, just to bring our attention back gently each time it wanders off. And a lot of our learners have been noticing that as they do that, the mind just starts to calm down and it becomes actually easier to focus, which is perhaps a bit paradoxical. A lot of us would expect that if we were very mentally tough and self-critical and tried to hold the attention on the breath, that's what would actually help us to stay focused for longer. And so it can be quite surprising to realize, if I'm gentle and patient with myself, that actually facilitates my ability to be present, whether it's in meditation or throughout the day. And related to that, of course, just recognizing that mind wandering is normal. It's the nature of the mind to wander. If we think about the brain as an organ, just like the heart pumps blood and the lungs breathe, the brain thinks. It's one of the things that it does. And we can't stop that. And if we try to stop it, if we react to it when it's happening, that actually just creates mental tension and makes things worse. And so to recognize, it's the nature of the mind to wander, and then to perhaps practice training the puppy and just gently bringing that attention back over and over and over again anytime we notice that it's wandered off. Perhaps that's the best thing that we can do, the best way to relate to that mind wandering. And of course, a lot of people notice that when they do that, the mind does start to calm down. And paradoxically, they spend more time in the present anyway. A lot of learners who've started to actually practice and apply mindfulness have started to note different benefits in the forums. Perhaps they become more relaxed or more focused, or they're getting to sleep more easily, or they're more compassionate with themselves and with others. And I think that's a very important thing to pay attention to, particularly early on in a mindfulness practice. To really notice those benefits can be very motivating. And so that's something that's really great to read about. Of course, some people have also expressed some scepticism about some of the research that we've talked about, and Craig's got some things to say about that.
Yeah, it was some good discussion, and there's a healthy kind of skepticism about the research that I think is very welcome. I think last year on PubMed there were 1,210 new papers on mindfulness published, and a variety of studies, and there are obviously gaps in the research and that need to be filled, and there are obviously things that signposts pointing in interesting directions that aren't totally resolved yet. But we certainly don't want to overstate the research, but boy, it looks very promising. And we don't want to think that mindfulness is the only thing, but it might be the foundation upon which other things can build. So, in dealing with mental health problems or in helping the brain, mindfulness might be very helpful, but there may be other things, other medical things, other counselling things that might be useful. So I think a healthy skepticism and questioning is good. At the same time, to be interested and open to the fact that there is as much research around as there is at the moment.
If any of the learners are wanting to read up a little bit more on the research and get a sort of a summary, as well as a way of understanding perhaps the quality of the research over the last 40 years, a really great book is called Altered Traits by Daniel Goleman of emotional intelligence fame and Richie Davidson, who's a leading researcher in the neuroscience of meditation. And so they've written this great book which just explores the research behind mindfulness over the last 40 years, and it's definitely well worth a read. Speaking of practical benefits, some of our learners talked about how politicians need mindfulness, and I think that's definitely true. And there's actually an initiative in the UK Parliament at the moment to get all of the politicians there practicing mindfulness in some way. And certainly, of course, it's a very interesting time in the UK. in terms of politics, with Brexit and all that kind of stuff happening. And so I imagine that this is a time that they definitely need some mindfulness, just to perhaps stay focused on what's important and manage all of those emotions, perhaps recognise that there's more that sort of unites them than separates them.
Do we need mindfulness in politics? I think we do. And of course, great shout out to the UK initiative, the All Parliamentary Initiative in the UK. And there have been Jamie Bristow and Chris Rowan and all the team over there working with Oxford, and it's been great. And now working with other parliaments around the world who are just starting to introduce this as a more formal initiative. So, because we need in Parliament the qualities of mindfulness, the pro-social attitudes, the really listening, the non-reactivity, trying to deal with our own biases. If mindfulness can help, I think that's a pretty good thing.
Finally, there's the informal practice. So we've got the formal practice of meditation, which is in some ways the foundation of mindfulness, really training the brain, strengthening the prefrontal cortex, and strengthening that ability to stay focused, as well as be self-aware and notice where the attention is. But then what about the other 23 hours and 50 minutes of the day? Are we then just getting out of the chair and just going back into default mode and distraction and autopilot? Or are we applying mindfulness in each moment? And a lot of our learners have started to talk about experiences of just bringing mindfulness to everyday activities, whether it's walking somewhere, cleaning their teeth, taking a shower, doing domestic chores, working, communicating. And the more that we do that, as some of our learners have been noticing and talking about in the forums, the more we do that, the more mindful we are throughout the day, and the better we tend to feel. And perhaps there's just a greater sense of being alive as well when we're really focused on what we're doing. So we'd strongly encourage bringing mindfulness to some everyday activities. And in fact, you might want to bring mindfulness to as many as you can and just notice the effect that that has. So it's a great way of cultivating mindfulness. So there's the formal practice, very important, and the informal practice and the applications, also important. And just finding an entry point for mindfulness, whether it's through meditation or informal practice, just starting wherever you start. That's probably the best way to do it. But to keep in mind that both of those things are important. And of course, kids know this. Some of our learners have noticed that, when they're observing kids are naturally in the moment. So in some ways, kids have that natural quality of mindfulness, of just being in the present, just fascinated and curious and interested in what they're doing and very connected to their senses. And that's perhaps something that we lose as we age. We lose touch with that just by, taking things for granted and thinking about the future and relating to the world through concepts and ideas and rushing around. And so any moment that we recognize we're doing that, we can reconnect with the senses, with that basic sense of curiosity and cultivate mindfulness in that way. So that's just about it for this week. Next week, we're going to explore the myth of multitasking and how when we start to unitask or monotask, that can actually improve our performance while at the same time reducing stress. We're going to look at some cognitive practices or some ways of thinking about or reflecting on mindfulness that help us to understand that a little better. So happy practicing this week, and that's all from me.
So goodbye from me. I look forward to being with everybody next week, and have a great week of practicing mindfulness.
That's a really good point. Who am I?